Robin. I'm an AmeriCorps Resilience Fellow in the South Portland Sustainability Department. And yeah, we're really excited to introduce Kelly today. Um, yeah, so Kelly Corbin is an ecologically based landscape designer and garden coach based in South Portland, and she works with clients looking to transform their yards, no matter how small, into vibrant habitats that can help support a range of bird and insect species while also offering beauty, refuge, and ease to their human stewards. Many Maine gardeners are eager to get to work in the spring, but many of our pollinators would prefer it if we just put down the rake. So we're really excited to hear from Kelly today to explore the ways our gardens can benefit local wildlife by changing not just what we plant in our gardens, but how we care for those gardens as well. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Kelly and yeah, thank you.
All right. Sounds great. Can everybody hear me? Robin, can you just give me a thumbs up to let me know that that's working? Awesome. I appreciate that since I can't really see any of you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for being here on a really beautiful Friday morning. And also a big thanks to the sustainability offices in Portland and South Portland for sponsoring this program. My name is Kelly Corbin. I live in South Portland. I've been here for about 15 years now, and I run a small business called Living Landscapes Maine. I'm a non-traditional landscape designer. I work with clients who need to be able to do the work themselves or want to be able to do the work themselves, but they're looking for some support and some guidance around transitioning a more traditional yard and garden to more ecologically friendly gardens, habitat gardening practices, pollinator gardens, whatever you want to call them. I work with people who are, trying to solve problems around what to plant, where to plant. Maybe they have challenges around invasive plants or drainage issues or privacy issues, and I try to work through solutions to that with all of them. And one of the questions I get a lot all the time is, well, but if I put this pollinator garden or if I change over to these gardening practices, isn't it going to look messy? I get this word all the time, messy. And I have to tell you, like, the word messy for me feels kind of complicated. Um, I I don't, so to back up just a little bit, I don't come from a design background. I also don't come from a horticulture background, and that's how most people get into landscape design. I actually come from an ecology background. So I spend a lot of time wandering around in the woods and thinking about why things are the way they are and how those ecosystems are functioning. And so lately, because of my clients asking me this question, I've been walking around in the woods and asking myself, well, is this messy? So this is a picture I took in Robinson Woods. That's in Cape Elizabeth, if you've never been there. I was walking my dog there the other morning and looking around and thinking like, well, okay, how does this word messy apply here? Would it ever apply here? So I would have to argue from an ecological point of view, sure, there's leaves all over the place and there's a tree down and broken branches, but from an ecological perspective, we would never refer to this picture as messy. It's actually very orderly. There's all sorts of function happening in this particular landscape. So, for example, all those fallen leaves down on the ground are providing valuable habitat for insects that have spent the winter in that leaf litter. They're also providing insulation for the plants that are starting to come up through the ground. This week in the woods, we have trout lily blooming. The wild geranium is starting to come up. I'm seeing trillium starting to bloom as well. And the leaves that are on the ground helped them get through the winter. The tree that we see decomposing in the middle of this picture is also really critical habitat. There's a lot of different insect species that would lay their eggs in that wood or stayed there over winter as an adult. The decomposing that those insects, excuse me, those insects also then create food for birds. Many different woodpeckers or other bird species are going to come along and harvest those insects out of those trees, and other animals are looking for those bugs as well. All of that plant material, the leaves and the wood decomposing, is naturally returning nutrients back into the soil. It's making the soil richer. It's helping the microbiome of the soil survive and thrive. All of that is also helping the soil sequester more carbon and hold more water. When this tree fell down and took a whole bunch of other stuff with it, it also created a gap in the canopy. It created an opening, and that allowed more sun to reach the ground and a different variety of plants to germinate and grow in that spot. And then the other thing that I really notice in this picture is that there's multiple layers of plants, and all of those different layers are providing different kinds of habitat. You've got that ground layer, which, like I mentioned, the trillium, the trout lily, the ferns that are coming up, those are offering one kind of habitat. There's a middle layer, dense shrubs, and young trees. In this picture, I think there was a lot of young cherry trees and also some elderberry. That's providing another kind of habitat. And then up at top, we have this canopy layer, the pines, the maples, the oak trees, the ash trees that are in this photograph. So from an ecological perspective, we would never call this messy. There's a tremendous amount of order and functionality happening in this picture. And as an ecologist, functionality is what I think is really the most beautiful thing in a landscape. Now, I totally get that clients are not coming to me asking for a front yard that looks like this, right? Totally fine. We are not looking for our front yards to look like this. But we can still apply a lot of these ecological principles to our own gardens. And in terms of best practices for ecological gardens, the two big things that we're going to try and get our heads around this morning is that we need to leave the leaves and we need to try to avoid cleanup. This photograph, I actually took this yesterday at Fort Williams, also in Cape Elizabeth. If you're looking for a good visual example of these gardening practices at work, I highly recommend a field trip to the children's garden. It is a garden that's been planted out with largely native and nearly native plants that's being managed according to these ecological principles. And so if you're feeling a little concerned about how this is going to look or how it's going to work in your own garden, go see for yourself what it's going to look like. So leaving the leaves, this isn't a densely forested plot, but even areas that do have more leaf cover on them, the leaves are just simply being left alone to decompose, to return those nutrients to the soil, and to protect our overwintering insects. They also do not come through and clean up this garden. So you can see kind of in the middle right there, there's a lot of stems that have been left standing from last winter. That's completely fine. That's still providing habitat value. In a few more weeks, you're really not going to notice them at all because the plant below it will have just grown up. And the last point that I want to remind people of is that the plants don't really need us to do this. I think we're often out working in the gardens because we think the plants need our help in these situations. But this is what plants have been doing for millions of years. They've been growing up, leaving the dead stems standing over winter. Some of them break, some of them fall down, the new growth comes up. Plants are accustomed to this cycle. They don't actually need us to come and mess around with that. They've got it, they can handle it. So these are two of our really big practices. Now, I want to acknowledge really quickly that I'm probably getting to this topic a little too late for some of you. Some of you have already been out there in your garden messing around, totally fine. I absolutely understand the urge and the need and the desire to be out working in the yard at this time of year. So, a couple of things that I do think are nice to be doing at this point in the year. One is invasive plant management. It's always a good time to be pulling out those Norway maple seedlings, to keep an eye out for the bittersweet, and addressing those issues as soon as possible. I also think it's just a good time to be paying attention, to start looking for the little tiny shoots to see what's coming up over what actually survived the winter, what is maybe getting a little too big for the space that it's in, what seems to be having a hard time of it. Those, I think, are really great activities to be doing in the garden right now. But to the best of our abilities, leaving the leaves and avoiding cleanup. There are many different species that are going to benefit from this messiness. I could spend the entire presentation just talking about different insects that are going to benefit. I could spend the next 3 hours talking about that as well, but we all have other stuff to do today, so I'm not going to torture you all with that. But just a few examples here. First of all, mourning cloak butterflies. This is usually one of our most identifiable butterfly species. It's the only one we have in Maine that actually overwinters as an adult. That's why we see them so early in the springtime. So these lovely creatures have actually spent the winter right underneath of the leaf litter, or sometimes under like the bark level of like a decomposing tree, something like that. That's giving them enough insulation to be able to ride out the winter time. Firefly larva. This one is one of my favorite talking points these days. So fireflies spend most of their lives in larval stages, and they're down in the soil while they're doing that. They're either in the first couple inches of the soil or just right there up in the leaf litter. Sometimes they're found in decomposing wood, but they need that kind of habitat in order to go through their life cycle. If we want those beautiful little lights in our yards in the summertime, as we need to let those adult insects go through those larval stages. If we start raking all of this material out of our yards in the fall or in the spring, then we're raking away those firefly larvae. That's what's in those lawn and leaf bags that are going off to the transfer station. And so we're not going to get those adults. And if we don't have those adult fireflies in our landscapes, we also don't get to have that memory. We don't get to share that experience with other people on those beautiful summer nights. So firefly larvae definitely need us to just kind of leave our gardens alone a little bit more. The last group of insects I want to bring up are cavity nesting bee species. This isn't a single kind of bee. This is actually a group of bees. There's a lot of different bees that will nest into dead wood as a way to complete their life cycles. Some of them, like the one pictured here, will actually excavate holes into wood and they're going to lay their eggs into that hole. Some of them are looking for dead plant stems, those standing dead plant stems that I just pointed out. They're often looking for ones from kind of hollow plants. These are things like Joe Pye weed, the bee balms, raspberries, all kind of have hollow stems to begin with. And the adult bee will just come in, they'll excavate the pith out from the center of that stem, and then they'll lay their egg within it. That is a process that they are going to do more in the fall, and then the egg and the larva will actually overwinter in that plant stem and they'll come out again in the springtime. So, again, we want to leave all of that stuff in place so that they can complete their life cycle. So just a few examples. There could be many, many more. Just as a quick note, in Maine alone, we have about 290 different species of native bees. We have around 120 different native species of butterflies and somewhere between 5 to 800 different kinds of moths. And these are all creatures that are going to benefit from these ecological gardening practices. A few other things to think about when transitioning to ecological gardens. This is a little snapshot from a small garden that I created in my backyard. Oh, this one has probably been in place for about 5 or 6 years. I just want to point out on the far right-hand side, there's last year's stems, right? We've got a seed head from Culver's root. We've got some other, it's probably New England aster and the nodding onion in there. And it's not exactly the main event in this garden. There's so much other stuff happening. The eye doesn't really get drawn to those things unless I directly point them out to you, which I just did. All right, so ecological gardening practices, planting in layers and planting densely. These kind of go well together. Planting in layers down at the front here. This doesn't always have to involve a large canopy tree. If you don't have room for a 75-foot red oak in your front yard, that's totally cool. There's lots of other ways that we can plant in different layers, so don't sweat it on that front. In the very front row of this photo, we have a plant called nodding wild onion. That's about as tall as it's ever going to get. There are some sedge species that you can't really see. They're off to the left-hand side. But these are plants that are going to be lush and green throughout the entire time. They're going to form that bottom layer. The other plants around them, and also that columbine, the thing that's in bloom right now, that also tends to stay pretty low. There are things like white turtlehead, great blue lobelia, and New England aster also in this photo. Those are going to get much taller than they are currently in this picture, so they're going to form that next layer. And then the brown stem that you're seeing in the background, that's a pussy willow. Pussy willow is an amazing plant to install in a Maine garden if you have the space for it. I love this shrub so much, and definitely native to Maine. Loves a little moisture, loves a little sunshine, or a lot of sunshine and a lot of moisture for that matter. But it's one of our earliest bloomers. So our insects, when they're starting to emerge in the springtime, they are looking for pussy willow flowers. They're looking for red maple flowers. Those are some of the most critical sources of pollen and nectar for our native insect species. Things like clover and dandelions are useful to them. They're not nothing. They're better than nothing, certainly. but they're really looking for the plants that they evolved with. And so pussy willow and red maple, those are two really, really important species in that like late April, early May window. And that also goes into this idea of always having something in flower. So those pussy willows are pretty much done now. Then columbine is going to get started soon. When the columbine, those gorgeous little red flowers, also hummingbirds love those. So another reason to plant those. When the columbine is done, then the turtle head and that lobelia and the nodding onion, those are going to be ready. And then we've got that New England aster that's going to carry this garden into the fall. And they are really densely planted together. I believe strongly in letting your plants touch. Again, if you go for a walk in the woods, if you go out to a meadow, you're not going to see plants isolated into these little islands. That's what we do. That's a human thing to create these plant islands. It's like a sea of wood mulch, and then there's a plant and a plant and a plant. That's not how nature does things. We can let these plants really knit themselves together, and it's actually going to be to our benefit and to the plant's benefit to do that. So, allowing these plants to knit themselves together is doing the weeding for me. Those plants are keeping out the plants that I don't want to come. I don't really have to get in there and weed this garden regularly because they've formed such a dense plant community of things that I do want. Underground, there's also benefits to this. Having some root competition is really normal and natural for plants. It actually helps plants grow even stronger by having to kind of be up against other plants. It makes the whole plant community stronger. So plant densely, green mulch, always something in flower. And then finally, just get to know your soil as well as your sun and your shade. This is pretty standard gardening advice, but I want to take it a little bit further. In ecological gardening, we use the mantra right plant, right place all the time. I think I say this like a million times a day. And certainly all of my clients have heard me say it quite a lot. Right plant in the right place. So, this particular area of my yard has a really heavy clay soil. And you might also have some really heavy clay soil in your yard. It's pretty common in Maine. If you don't know if you have clay soil, it's really easy to figure it out. You just need to put your shovel in the ground. And for starters, like if your lower back just hurts immediately, you probably have clay soil. It's very heavy. If you're not sure from that, actually get in touch with the soil. Start to feel it. What you're going to notice is that it's sticky. You're going to notice that you can roll it into like a little log, just the same way that you would do with Play-Doh. The more it sticks together, the longer that little ribbon gets, the more clay you have in your soil. You might also notice other textures, though. You might notice sand. And then the other element of soil is loam. All of our soils are some combination of those three things. It might be a lot of one and not much of another, but it's going to be some kind of a mixture. So because I knew that this particular garden had a lot of clay soil to it, I could match the plants not just to the amount of sunshine and shade this area gets, but also to that very particular type of soil. Now, soil, another thing on that, there's no such thing as bad soil. I think clay in particular gets this really bad rap. I've met a lot of gardeners who want to do something about their clay soil. They're going to rip it all out and pay someone to cart it away and bring a bunch of loam in. If you are going to be working with native plants, you don't need to do that. In fact, you really shouldn't do that. The native plants in Maine are really familiar with nutrient poor soils. Clay tends to be fairly nutrient poor just because it holds on to the nutrients. Other soils just don't have a whole lot of nutrient value to begin with. Acidic soils tend to be kind of nutrient poor as well. This is all normal and natural according to plants that are native to the state of Maine. They're used to that. If we put them in like a really rich garden loam, they start doing kind of different things. They might just not thrive at all to begin with because they don't particularly like that kind of habitat. Or they might get really, really tall, like a foot taller than the plant tag said that it was going to be. They often get really floppy if they're in really nutrient rich soils. So, no need to amend soils. Just get to know what you have and then plant accordingly. Maybe it's sandy, maybe it's full of clay. Just know what you have and figure it out and then, figure out what wants to go in there. Main Audubon has an incredibly helpful plant finder tool where you can actually plug in all of those different variables, not just whether your soil is wet or dry, but you can actually add that element around. It's called soil texture, sandy, clay, loam. We call that soil texture, and you can plug in those elements and it's going to give back a list of plants that would be appropriate for that site. So layers, planting densely, always something in flower, and just really get to know what you're working with. I have to take a minute to talk about lawns. I could take way more than a minute to talk about lawns. I think lawn is really what kind of got me interested in this line of work to begin with. I bought a house about 15 years ago here in South Portland. The house came with a lawn, and I became a lawn mower, which is what you do when you buy a house with a lawn. And very quickly, I started asking some questions about why am I doing this? And what am I actually doing? And why am I doing this? Really, I just kind of kept coming back to that one. From an ecological perspective, to get back to that idea of functionality in a landscape, this picture to me is actually kind of a mess, right? There is disorder in this landscape. Lawn has really no ecological value whatsoever. It does a terrible job at absorbing rainwater. It does a terrible job of sequestering carbon, and it really doesn't provide any habitat value whatsoever. In addition to that, lawn in the US is our single largest crop. It is the thing we grow more than we grow corn or soy or wheat or, things we actually consume in order to survive. In America right now, we have 40 to 50 million acres just in lawn, and 40% of that is in residential areas. So that's areas that we have a whole lot of control over. It's also the most irrigated crop that we grow in the United States. And crop is like a weird word to use here, but this is always how it's referred to in the literature. So, yeah, we put more water on our lawns than we put on anything that we actually eat. And just a quick note about the grasses that we grow for our yards. These grasses fall into a category that botanists refer to as cool season grasses. That means, as we're kind of seeing right now, they get green and lush and healthy when it's a little bit cooler out. So in Maine, that's going to be the spring, and then again in the fall. In the middle, in July and August, they're going to go dormant. They're going to get brown and dry and crispy. Nothing is wrong with that. Your lawn is completely fine. It's just kind of taking a nap, and then it's going to green up again in the fall. What we're doing when we water our lawns throughout the summertime, we're sort of trying to trick the plant into doing something it's not biologically programmed to do at all. We're trying to convince it, like, no, 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 it's actually still a nice, cool time of year. Keep growing. It's not actually all that beneficial for the grass itself, and it's using a whole lot of water that could be used in much more useful ways. The last note, because this is coffee and climate, an hour of mowing a lawn using a gas-powered mower is the equivalent to 100 miles of driving. It has an enormous carbon footprint. Um, Gas-powered mowers, those small engines, they're just notoriously inefficient. The leaf blowers, string trimmers, any of that gas-powered lawn equipment, we can all kind of put into this category. They emit huge amounts of carbon. And again, for what purpose? Now it is May, so I wanted to come back to the idea of no mow May. Lots of conversations about this right now. So no mow May, yay or nay? And I have to admit, I've really come all the way around on this. I used to be a big proponent of no mow May. I thought it was such a great idea. And the more I've learned and the more I've studied it and the more research I've seen around it, I'm not totally convinced. I do really value it for a few reasons. I love that it's starting the conversation. I love that it's making people think differently about lawn care. I love that it's making people think about how pollinating insects might be using their yard. All of that stuff is awesome. Great. Two thumbs up. No complaints. But how it's actually impacting the usefulness it's really having, that's what I think is kind of questionable. So, some research was done a few years ago in Massachusetts where they mowed different lawns, different suburban lawns at different intervals. And what they found was that lawns that get mowed every week, no good. There's like no pollinating insects whatsoever that are coming to a lawn that is mowed every single week. But a lawn that was mowed every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, they did start seeing more insects coming to use those lawns, more bees, more butterflies, things like that. It was never the full complement of pollinating insects we have. We have, like, again, 290 different species of bees just in Maine. They mostly saw honeybees, which are a non-native species. They saw some bumblebees, but it wasn't like a tremendously diverse array of insects using these lawns, but it was sure better than that 1 week strategy. After that 2 to 3 week mark, the benefit of not mowing just kind of leveled off. It didn't really get any better to mow beyond that. So leaving your lawn alone for a full month doesn't really have that much more habitat value than mowing every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. So the better mantra here, I think, is mow tall until fall. So, and by mow tall, what I'm looking for is a lawn that's around 3.5 inches or more. That's tall enough that you're going to allow those clovers and dandelions to bloom. You're also going to be able to see maybe some native species, our wild strawberry, native violet species, maybe some self-heal. Those are all species that could get in under that height and start to flower. But again, that lawn, even that 3 week lawn, is not going to offer as much habitat value as native plant gardens. Clover and dandelions are never going to be as important to our indigenous pollinating insects as our native flowering plants are. So I really think the best thing to do in May is simply to begin transitioning lawn, as much of it as possible, to native plant gardens. Now, I'm not saying 100%. I never advise clients to rip out their front lawn all in one go. Please, that is not what you're hearing right now. I think this is a great thing to do in a slow and steady way. I would advise people to take small bites out of their lawn than going all in all at one time. I'd rather people have small successes that they can build on that stays really manageable to them. So here's an example of what that might look like. This is a section of my yard that I took out, I think, 2 years ago at this point. And my preferred way to do that is a technique called sheet mulching. You may have heard the term sheet mulching before. It's sometimes used interchangeably with lasagna gardening. That to me is more, lasagna gardening to me really refers to a way to build vegetable gardens and add a lot of organic matter into the soil. That's not what we're trying to do with this kind of sheet mulching. I'm just trying to kill the grass as with as little effort for me as I possibly can manage. Okay, I'm a pretty lazy gardener. I should out myself on that. So the first step here, actually, the first step is not on this slide. The first step is to identify the part of the lawn you want to get rid of. In my situation, I didn't love this area for a couple of different reasons. For starters, anytime I have to switch out my lawnmower for the string trimmer, I find that kind of annoying. It's just inefficient. It makes the whole process take longer. The second reason I chose this area is because the only time I even walk through this section on the side of my house was to mow it. So if there's a part of your yard and the only thing you ever do with it is mow it, that sounds like a really good candidate for perhaps a native plant garden. All right, so to do this process, mow the lawn as short as possible. Lower, like, ignore my mow tall until fall rule. Mow it as short as possible. And then you want to cover that with cardboard. Take all the tape off, take all the staples off, cover it with cardboard. Make sure the edges overlap. About 6 inches or more is going to help prevent things from coming up in between those edges. Not dandelions. Dandelions are coming up no matter what. You're just going to have to hand pull them. That's the deal. On top of the cardboard, a few inches of just a regular, undyed, shredded bark mulch. I would go maybe about 3 inches deep on this. That's the only mulch this garden is ever going to get. I planted this garden in such a way that the plants, again, they're going to be that green mulch. You can see right up against the edge of the house, I didn't actually kill everything off entirely. Most of that is wild strawberry. I love wild strawberry as a ground cover, so I was more than happy to leave that alone because it's just filling in the garden on its own now. The next most important step here is to wait and to use that time for planning. If you start this process right now, then you're going to be ready to plant in the fall, which I love. Fall planting is really ideal in a lot of ways. You can also start this process in the fall and then be ready to replant in the following spring. I know there's another way of doing this. There are people who will cover it in cardboard, add a few inches of loam, and then the mulch, and then they'll just plant straight in right at that time. I don't love that option. I don't love having to bring in loam from off-site. You are putting yourself at risk of bringing in all sorts of other things, weed seeds, maybe jumping worms. It costs more money, it takes more time, it's more material to move. I really like the low and slow, set it and forget it version of sheet mulching. And it also buys you all this time to make a plan, to figure out what is going to want to be in there, to figure out your sun and your shade and your soil, and to come up with a good plant list that you can then go forward with. And all of that is going to add up into that really lovely functional garden, right? A functional is beautiful. That's really what my aim is with these ecological gardens, is to think not beyond this word messy into something that is really providing all kinds of habitat value, that's doing a better job of sequestering carbon, that's doing a better job of storing water, while also offering some lovely flowering plants for us to look at. All right, so that is the end of my formal presentation. If you have any more questions, if you want to schedule a site visit with me, I'd love to have a conversation with you. That's my email there, livinglandscapesmaine@gmail.com. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it back over and we will do some Q&A.
That was
Thank you
great.
so
Thank you
much,
so much.
Kelly.
We have a few questions in the chat, but also feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak and ask your questions like that. So we have a few questions about leaves.
Yeah.
We have many. We are trying to get through all of them, but there might not be enough time.
Sure.
Um, so leaves. What is a good layer of leaves to leave? I find that when I leave all the leaves, it kills anything else that used to grow and leaves a patch of dirt slash mud.
Yeah. I am going to make some predictions about the person asking the question, and I'm going to say they probably have maybe some denser oak trees in their yard. Speculation, I might be wrong. Oak leaves break down faster than, or I'm sorry, not faster, opposite. They break down slower than other species because of the tannins that are in those leaves. So if you're in one of those situations where your leaves, when you're walking through your yard in the fall, it's more of like a wading pool kind of feel. They're like shin deep. Yeah, that's probably gonna be too much. I might rake off like the first week or two that they're coming down and then try to leave everything else. I know in my yard, what honestly, all I have out front is a Norway maple that I would love to see taken down at some point anyway. I leave everything from that, and the plants do just fine. Some of it also has to do with the species of plants. There are some things that are a little more sensitive to leaf cover and others that are a little bit more robust. I don't have a great mental list of those. I know that like foam flower is a lovely shade plant, but it's not going to do well with that deep leaf litter situation. But most of our fern species, big leaf aster, they're not going to care at all. They're just going to be able to come right up through stuff. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit about how much leaf litter you really have and really what's under it specifically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question about leaves, and then maybe we'll move on to a different topic. So if we rake up leaves in the spring and pile them up in an area of our property, will that maintain the leaves as a habitat shelter while still allowing us to uncover our gardens?
It's a little yes and a little no. Um, It is disturbance to those insects, right? It is like picking them up and moving them is not ideal. That wasn't, what they were hoping would happen, essentially. So, in terms of valuing what's happening for those overwintering insects, just simply leaving it alone is really the best possible option. Again, if you're in a situation where the leaf litter is excessively deep and you feel like it's smothering the plants, then I might remove some of it, but not all of it. And just, it's always a compromise, right? I think that's really what we're kind of getting to with both of these questions is that the ideas that I present are sort of in best practice category, but we're all going to be interpreting that in our yards in slightly different ways. So if you're noticing a lot of plant die off, that you think is due to a heavy layer of leaves, then yes, you might need to take off a few inches. Storing them in your yard somewhere to let them compost, certainly better than putting them in those lawn and leaf bags and sending them off to the transfer station.
We have one question. Maybe if they want to speak, person has their hand raised. Yeah, perfect. Feel
Hello,
free.
thank you. Appreciate the presentation and the mindset. Wonder if you have any advice for dealing with Japanese knotweed, particularly in the shoreland zone.
Oh. Um, I haven't seen your site, and that always makes it a little bit tricky because invasive plant management is so much dependent on the specific context that you're in. I also want to note the specific context of Portland and South Portland and some of the herbicide regulations that they have. Japanese knotweed, especially in sensitive areas like shoreland and any sort of wetter area, is usually a better candidate for careful, thoughtful, targeted herbicide use than anything else because the potential to damage soil and cause erosion is so great. And if Japanese knotweed, root fragments go drifting downstream, they're just going to take up residence somewhere else and grow. Um, but again, that's speaking without actually having seen the size of the stand you're dealing with. There are so many different factors at work. Um, but typically in that kind of environment and careful herbicide application is really your best bet.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
Me too. I work for the city of Portland, so I don't have any one particular site. It's a recurrent issue on the coast, in wetland areas, etc. And yeah, it's a very challenging, issue. So like even what to replace it with, I don't know.
Yeah, and
I'm
and
not
you're
an
not
arborist, but
right, and you're not going to be able to replace it until it's fully done. Scarborough Land Trust is doing some interesting work applying mesh, like I want to say it's like half-inch, maybe metal mesh on giant stands of knotweed. It doesn't kill the knotweed. What happens is when the knotweed starts to grow up through the mesh, it fragments it. It basically weakens the plant, and they're showing some pretty good results. It's still a long, slow process, but it might be worth getting in touch with Scarborough Land Trust and asking them some questions about how it's working.
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have time for a few more questions. So there are some questions about non-native plants. So someone was talking about, a couple of people were talking about dandelions, that pollinators seem to love them. So should we remove them? That's kind of the question that people seem to have.
Yeah. The rule I've created in my own yard is that I take them out of my intentional garden beds, but I don't care if they're in my lawn. I still have lawn space and they're fine there. The deal with dandelions is this for the spring blooming dandelion evolved in Europe. That's where it came over from. And so, because of that, it has more limited value to the full complement of pollinating insects that we have here in Maine. So, you're definitely going to see bees on dandelions. You're just not going to see every species of bee go to dandelions. Some bees are generalists, like honeybees are generalists. A lot of our bumblebees are generalists, which just means that they'll go to anything. Like if it's in flower, they're going to go see if they can get some pollen out of it. But we also have a lot of bee species and butterflies and moths and wasps, etc., that are specialists, which means they're just looking for a few particular species that they are going to try and go forage from. And if we just have a whole lot of dandelions and we don't have those other things that they're looking for, like the pussy willows, the red maples, for example, then they're just kind of out of luck in our yards. So I think I wouldn't go crazy trying to get them out of your lawn. I would just think like, okay, you're fine over here, but I'm going to make sure that I have a lot of other plants represented to make sure that I'm covering more bases for more pollinators.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this seems to answer another question that says if it's confusing or not to native fauna about having mixing native flowers with non-native flowers. But I think that answers your
No,
question. Hopefully,
they're
yeah.
smarter. They're smarter than we are. I also just want to say, because I just mentioned herbicide use in the context of Japanese knotweed, I just want to point out I would never apply an herbicide, organic or synthetic, to a dandelion. Like it's just not important enough. It's not worth it. There's always collateral damage for those products. I think the point I want to make is that like there's a time and a place, and we just need to be thoughtful about what that is. And it's not dandelions. So.
Also, we have a specific ordinance about herbicide and pesticide use. So, yeah.
Yeah. Which does make allowances for invasive plants.
Yes, but maybe not dandelions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what about invasives? Okay, so another couple questions about invasives. What are the most important invasives that you're concerned about people focusing on removing? So how do we distinguish between maybe the more important invasives to take out versus less harmful ones?
I think some of it is site specific. Overall, from the state of Maine's perspective, Japanese knotweed is right on up there. Shrubby honeysuckles are very problematic. Um, bittersweet is certainly one that I would be working on really hard if that were problematic in my yard. And, I feel like burning bush needs to get mentioned too. The shrubby honeysuckle and burning bush, these are two that were in the ornamental nursery trade. That's how we got them. And so they are still being grown as ornamentals quite frequently. And again, if you're looking for something to do in your yard this weekend, maybe it is time for that burning bush to go or that shrubby honeysuckle to go. Privet is the other one. Privet landed, there's a few different species of privet. And I know a lot of people have those giant privet hedges, and the idea of losing all of it all at one time is like that would probably be a radical change on somebody's landscape. But maybe you could start doing a smaller shift. Maybe a couple of those go this year, and you start replacing it with a more native, eco-friendly hedge option.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask a question about like renters or people who don't have yards necessarily, and if there's any way that they can still be a part of the movement and maybe plant native plants in window boxes or what you would recommend for them.
Yeah, all of our native plants are going to do just fine in planters. If you want them to be able to overwinter in a pot, if you'd like to put it in this year and then also have it for next year, then you want to look for plants that are going to be hardy to 2 zones north of where we are currently. So we are in USDA hardiness zone 5. So you want to look for something where it's going to be hardy to at least zone 3 on the plant tag, and that's going to let it overwinter in a pot. You can certainly also just treat them as annuals. You could buy something that isn't native that far north, but just know that it is going to act like an annual. It'll freeze over winter, and then you would just have to replant that. But yeah, definitely no reason not to put them in pots.
Yeah, on this topic, or what are some simple ways homeowners can start incorporating native plants to support pollinators and local wildlife? I'm sure you've touched upon it already, but just to give a few tips to leave us
Yeah,
with.
yeah. I think leaving some down and dead wood in parts of your garden are actually sort of like a sneaky important thing to do. Everybody's just looking to plant flowers, and that's great. I want to plant flowers too. After this, I'm going to go to the garden store and I'm going to buy some flowers because I'm ready to see that in my yard. But yeah, having just some places where you can leave maybe a small brush pile, or maybe somewhere in your garden, there's just like a decomposing log or a stump somewhere. There's actually enormous habitat value out of all of those things. That is habitat that many things are looking for. It doesn't have to be front and center, doesn't have to be the first thing you see when you pull into your driveway, but finding some places where you can just kind of leave some of that decomposing wood in your yard is incredibly helpful. And then if you have an existing garden, if there's space in between your plants, you've got room for more stuff. And then I think it's just a matter of doing some research. That main Audubon plant finder tool that I mentioned is incredibly useful. They have a native plant sale going on right now. Scarborough Land Trust is doing a native plant sale on May 30th. I will be there answering questions about plants if you're not sure what might work in your yard. And then Audubon's native plant sale and festival is on June 6th. And so those are all resources that you can utilize to make sure that you are, plugging in the things that really are going to be the most useful.
Yeah, that sounds great. Also, we have a new page on our website about Grow Wild Portland, and we try to compile a list of resources to start growing your own native yard or also on the esplanades around the city, which can be applied also to South Portland as well. And yeah, if anyone wants to raise their hand and have a talk to us, yeah, we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, maybe time for a few more questions. And yeah, we had over 60 people join us today, which is really exciting.
Fantastic.
Um,
I can speak a little bit more to that last question too, Emma. I want to, so I was talking about dead and decomposing wood, but also woody plants in general. Again, you might not have room for that 75-foot tall oak tree, but if you do, you should plant one. But shrubs are actually also have kind of outsized habitat value. And a shrub doesn't have to be 12 feet tall. Again, if you're working with a smaller yard, you might be looking for something like a New Jersey tea, which is like 3 feet tall, but all sorts of different insects are looking for that species. If you're trying to narrow down what you're looking for and focus on the things that are most important from a habitat value, you can look into the idea of keystone plants. Keystone plants are species that have been identified as serving the most number of different pollinating insects. So, like we were talking about clover and dandelions earlier, that only a few things are going to look for those. Keystone species are the native plants that the majority of our insect species are actually going to be looking for. Oaks are considered a keystone species. In terms of perennials, things like goldenrods and our native sunflowers fall into that category. And all of that research, that's a pretty simple Google search to just, keystone plants, Maine, New England will come up with a pretty thorough list for you all.
yeah, we also have another question about ticks and leaf litter. So any suggestions on how to keep our yard safe while also leaving things alone?
First of all, I want to point out that Pfizer has recently completed phase 3 human trials with a Lyme vaccine, and they're going to be submitting that information to regulatory agencies as of this year. So there is an effective Lyme vaccine that is in the works. So that is like amazing news. It's still probably several years off, but I just want people to know that that's out there and it's coming. In terms of our yards ourselves, I really don't want to get people to, associate these wilder gardens with, oh, and then I'm going to get all sorts of ticks. I think that's incredibly unfair. I have definitely had, like, I've picked up ticks in very neatly mowed lawns, and I have not picked up ticks out in the woods. So it's not like a one-to-one relationship, like bigger, wilder plants equals ticks. It doesn't quite work like that. Ticks are everywhere. The main thing we're going to do isn't so much about landscape management, it's going to be about how we protect ourselves. So it's going to be about doing tick checks when you come in from outside, treating clothes with permethrin-based pesticides tend to be pretty effective. There are some that you can even wash into your clothes so that the treatment just stays impregnated into the fabric. And then in terms of landscaping, two things that I would look into doing. If you're building out lots of gardens, I would maintain pretty wide paths in between them. So like a 6-foot mowed swath in between gardens. That's really useful because a lot of times what happens with ticks is that they climb out to the edge of foliage, to a blade of grass or a leaf or something. And then that's where they hitch a ride with something as it goes, perhaps a human. So if you have a nice wide path to move through, then you're less likely to brush up against that vegetation. The other solution I would look into is called tick tubes. You can buy tick tubes. You can also do a 5-minute Google search and learn how to do them yourself. Envision a toilet paper roll, just the empty tube, and it gets filled with usually cotton balls that have been treated again with an insecticide, a permethrin-based insecticide, and then strategically placed around the yard. What happens is that mice come to the tick tube and they take that cotton to build their nests out of, and then that's where it kills the ticks. Mice are really the number one way that Lyme disease moves around and gets transmitted. So if you're catching the ticks that are on the mice, then you can help prevent them from getting into your yard.
We have maybe one last time for one last question. It's about, this is a very common problem, I'm sure. So this person says they have a garden on the road and it gets road salt runoff. Any soil amendments or plant choices for this plot? I think that's maybe a common question that pops
Yeah,
up, especially in the winter.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fun to think about the salt spray on our roads as being somewhat equivalent to the salt spray coming off of the ocean. So plants that are adapted to be on the coastline can sometimes handle living in that situation. The one that I come back to a lot is called Arctic bearberry, Arctostaphylos uva ursii, if you're looking for the Latin. Arctic bearberry is considered a subshrub, meaning that it only gets about 6 inches tall, and it forms a mat. So it just kind of spreads out nice and slowly, but it can handle a pretty punishing situation. It can handle a good amount of salt spray. It's not looking for the richest soil on earth. So I often advocate for that one right along roadsides. Creeping juniper can also usually handle those conditions. That's the other one that I typically look for. And I often like the idea of just kind of using those plants, if you are in a heavy salt area, using them kind of as a buffer right along that road, and then other garden plants go behind it that aren't getting that salt spray thrown onto them as much.
Those are great tips. Um, yeah, I think I don't see many more questions. Um, we can wait maybe one more minute, see if anyone wants to raise their hand. That would be great change of pace than just hearing us talk.
And if
Um,
you come up with questions later, please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to just, yeah, chat through issues.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for joining us today on such a beautiful spring day, too.
Yeah,
I'm
good.
very
I hope
excited
you're outside.
for gardening. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions, but we'll send out a follow-up email shortly with the recording and yeah, Kelly's contact information if you think of any other questions. And yeah, I think that's everything. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Um,
this was great.
and happy gardening season soon.
Thank you so
But also
much.
leave the leaves and everything.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.